Hello, good day, everyone. Probably good morning for those in our region, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the friends from the other side of the world. So, my name is Farzad, assistant professor from City University of Macau. I would like actually to start sharing our experience on the pandemic time, how we did it, basically on learning the experience. So please hold me, let me open up my PowerPoints. Okay, so I believe everyone can see the PowerPoints. Okay, so my talk will be about developing the learning process management. So I found this topic to be quite important because during the pandemic time, last semester basically, we did all of our subjects online, and there was a lot of concern about developing technologies in this respect. However, something was actually missing in the point, and that was actually the learning process that is going to happen by such a big shift that we went from a face-to-face mode to the online mode. So much of the concern was back to whether we have suitable technologies in place, or whether everything is going smoothly online. In fact, that gave me the idea of getting back to the basics, and that's why I try to come up with the idea of proposing on learning process management in terms of putting a lot of more focus on learning experience instead of technology. Let me just give you a brief explanation about when we are talking about these two terms as learning technology versus learning experience. So for the technology side, basically, usually the things that are part of a concern all the time is whether we will have the available solution. So for example, if you're supposed to go for online teaching, whether we do have online teaching platforms like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, etc. So basically, they are looking for different available solutions. And in fact, probably either many schools, many universities, although they are delivering different subjects at very different levels, they are basically using more or less a similar type of technologies. Apparently, platforms that we're using like Zoom, etc., has been used among all from primary schools to university. So there's somehow what we call them as a context agnostic. They do not look at what context or the delivery level is for the learning purposes. And third, apparently, is the one-size-fits-all model. So basically, we just get the technology and adopt it into different scenarios, let's say. On the other side, when we are talking about the learning experience, we have to look at what we call it as a based on the base solution. Instead of looking for available solutions, we have to find the best one. Probably lots of the technologies that we are using, probably some may work in some scenarios, some may not work in that specific scenario. So we have to be quite selective in what works with what scenario and what doesn't. Second is the matter of being context aware. For example, if you're delivering a subject for a primary school compared to university, probably you need more gamified elements. So in fact, your platform should be more attractive in terms of a platform itself compared to the ones in a higher education. So apparently it needs to be more context aware. And third one, which is basically the most important one, is the developing a personalized learning tools. Different learners do have different needs, even in the same level. So apparently we have to come up with solutions that are tends to be more personalized in this respect. So we try to actually come up and answer 3 questions for ourselves to start developing our learning process management. First one was about when we are talking about technology enhanced learning. How is it different from a digital online education? Digital online education has been around for quite a long time. But the point is that technology enhanced learning is not just only about digitalization. In fact, as the name suggests, we have to get back to the roots and think about how we are able to use the technology to enhance learning. So the focus is again on a learning. and technology will be considered to be as a facilitator. So this interpretation that has been going around is actually kind of downgraded it in many scenarios to digital online education. The second question we tried to answer was about the social learning experience, because in this scenario, basically when the peoples are getting apart in a virtual world rather than a face-to-face, they need to actually get a lot of experience probably through social learning. So how will we be able to implement this instead of just simply trying to think and predict what they might be interested in? So this is again one of the challenges that we had. And the third one, which in fact is kind of a most important one among these three, is the matter of quality of a learning experience. So ultimately, if you're going to have all these things in place, how the quality of the learning is going to be affected, and how the experience ultimately will present itself in the learning outcomes if we will apply some quality metrics. So what we try to do for our work, basically, we try to develop two ways to think about different subjects. So we'll try to combine some approaches, and we bring it on to what we call it as prescriptive learning process. And later I will talk about this exploratory. So, well, because of lack of time, I'm not able to go into details of each of these experiments, but let me briefly explain to you what basically we have tried to do in terms of developing the framework for that. So the first one was basically the prescriptive learning process management. This is the time that our courses or the subjects that we are dealing with are more kind of well-structured, rather maybe scientific works, which are kind of more towards the objective outcome. Let's say, for example, subjects in science, like mathematics, physics, etc. So for these kind of subjects, we try to first identify what are supposed to be the learning outcomes, defining the learning outcomes, probably similarly to what many of you may do in terms of developing a course curriculum, etc. But when it comes to the design, we did not want to think about designing to be as just giving some instructions, but rather trying to think about developing some kind of a learning path. So in this matter of a learning path, probably there are some flexibility in terms of how each student is actually going through the subject. For example, let's say for the mathematics subjects in a higher education, let's say year one students, they are supposed to work on kind of a project based on their own learning. Well, some students, especially when they are exposed to different subjects in mathematics, they might be interested in some and they may not show much interest in another. When they are going to propose it based on a project, they will be able somehow to aggregate a lot of this together with the emphasis probably on the parts that they are interested. So we gave them the flexibility instead of just sitting for an exam to complete those mathematic questions, thinking about defining some kind of a project which basically can apply this kind of a mathematical or formulas that they have learned throughout the course. Probably they could include some which they are better, and they probably less focus on the ones that they are not interested or they're not good at it. So in fact, even for such a kind of subject, which tries to create some different learning paths, because as long as they can finally make a decision based on the models that they have developed, and as long as those models follows those scientific steps, it is considered to be valuable because it has met the learning outcome. The third one, we try actually to bring it down and break it down into learning steps. So that's why we try to create quite a clear-cut steps so that how they can go through this process. So for example, if they are supposed to develop the project for mathematics, what sort of things they have to take into account, and in which areas they have to follow the structure, in which areas they will have the flexibility for changing according to their needs and desires. And ultimately, we'll get into the evaluations, basically to after they're submitting their projects, to see how was their initial feeling about the learning experience and how much they've learned from a subject which is more or less tends to be slightly maybe difficult for some students without a mathematic background. So in this way, basically we try to evaluate the learning experience from the scenario that they have developed based on their project. So this one moves on a prescriptive learning project process management. The other one, which basically we develop, is for the subjects that are supposed to be more of a subjective nature. Let's say, for example, on research methodology subjects. In these situations, the students probably need to think about quite a diverse range of topics, and it basically starts from imagination. So we started to teach them, okay, what are the principles of a research methods, but apparently it is not a clear-cut rules, because every different researcher probably follows things in a very, very different way. We tries to give them the power of imagination about the possibilities of the ways that they can do the research. And then we tries to let them discover some of these concepts and principles. So basically, the whole research method, instead of telling the students how to do research, we try to come up with just some concepts and principles about what a research should be and what a research probably should not be, and let them apply those imagination about the topics or anything they have in mind to match it with this kind of concepts and principles. And then, based on such a kind of concepts and principles, basically, we try to develop what we call it as a learning paradigms, the ways that they are able to think about what they want to achieve from the research that they are doing. Some of them more interested in doing scientific research, hypothesis testing, some were interested in developing case studies, some were interested in developing action research, etc. The point is that this kind of whatever type of a research that they come by, it is going to be developed based on a learning paradigm that they are more comfortable and more interested to learn with. And ultimately, they will come with a report, which this report was kind of a learning experience that they could receive feedback from instructor, from the other peer classmates, etc. And based on this feedback, probably they could develop the whole idea, and probably for some of them maybe good enough for publication. So in fact, in this scenario, we'd rather focus on exploratory learning process in a way to give such kind of capabilities so that they will be able to go from their imaginations to evolving their projects over time. So ultimately, I'll just like to briefly put things together. I call it as, well, as my background is on knowledge management mostly. I just call it a lesson learned from a knowledge management, and I would like to refer to this Nonaka Sessi model on socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization. In fact, the learning process is kind of combination of all these four steps. People do learn through socialization. They tries to externalize it. They tries to combine it, and ultimately, probably they tries to internalize it. What the technology is supposed to do is somehow to be able to make the things move easier and more smoothly among these four phases. The technology is not supposed to be the core part of the learning or is going to be the biggest concern about the learning. The technology is only working as a facilitator in this respect. And the more important thing is that how we are able to develop these phases in terms of learning process management and model it, rather than too much put focus on the technology itself in terms of the development of a learning experience, as I can say. So this was actually the idea that we had, and then we're still working on it to basically use technology as a facilitator and more put a focus on how we will be able, with lots of changes in the environment and the pandemic, be able to think about developing a better learning process management based on the learning experience. Okay, and that's all for my talk. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this. If you're any questions or anything, I think we'll left with a few minutes to ask. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your interesting presentation, which is more on the differentiated learning to make how to make the differentiated learning to be happen in real life. Are there any questions from the floor? If not, then may I ask a questions? Because as I have said that you want to add the flexibility and feasibility for student to learning. But is there any practical ways that you have tried to make it practical, or just a model, or just a conceptual model?
We have actually tried these two ways that I mentioned to you. One is on the experiential and one is on prescriptive, depending on what kind of a subjects that we have. Apparently, there are more choices that you can think about in terms of application, but depending on the subjects and the learning outcome of the subjects. So our division for the research that we are basically doing is basically we are looking at the learning outcome to understand whether the learning outcome is more towards the objective learning outcome or subjective learning outcome. And we have divided the subjects basically in this aspect to see which paths we are actually going through. Again, this is not a clear cut that you just say there are only two approaches. Probably you can think about more of diversification. Even for some subjects, probably they may have a lab as part of them. They will mix of hands-on experience and theories. So apparently there are more choices to be able to proceed with that. But just this is a simplistic way probably to look at it, that the technology is only works as a facilitator. We have to think about behind the scene how we are able to improve the process as a whole.
Oh, I see. That's mean can you illustrate it with a any example that you have used it in any subject that you have used it?
So for two subjects that I gave an explanation, for prescriptive one, we did it for mathematics, business mathematics for year one students, which they are quite new to the subjects and they had some learning outcomes to achieve. So in this scenario, probably they need to learn the concepts and theories quite well, and they have to apply it to a scenario. So in this situation, we try to have that kind of prescriptive because they need to actually fit themselves in. For the other one was on a research method for our year four students, which basically are more experienced and they are supposed to come up with something like a final year project. So in this way, it is more kind of experiential learning as kind of exploratory. So they will actually somehow give flexibility to explore themselves, find the topics themselves, and develop with their some kind of guidelines rather than given some concepts and theories to be able to develop.
Oh, I see. Then are there any challenges for you to implement this model into practice? Because
Yeah, of course, apparently, depending, especially the one that is going to exploratory, if the students are not comfortable, again, this is what we call it as some students do prefer that they have given very clear-cut guidelines. So then they given flexibility to explore. Apparently, they're getting lost. So this is, in fact, one of the challenges. If the students are not ready for it, they probably may get into trouble when it's about exploration.
oh, I see, I see. Are there any questions from the floor? If not, then thank you for your presentation, and now we move on to another group.